Before the war, we had a seemingly large amount of people who were generally sympathetic to Moscow. The latest survey shows that only 4% is still supporting Moscow. It means basically no one. We have a law in our country recently passed that if you are drinking far, far too much alcohol, the government takes your car. And someone, my finance minister, says, why don't we donate them to the Ukrainian army? And we're sending them to Ukraine. So I can say that our society is 100% supporting Ukraine, even the people who drink and drive.
Do you see that the idea of Russia that should be destroyed is widely popular?
I don't see anything very positive. Russia will not change in the near future. It's in everyone's interest, not only Ukraine's, but all of Europe's, that Ukraine would be in the NATO alliance. It's not at all that other countries are saying, yes, yes, of course, of course. They are not yet ready, but they will be.
Prime Minister, thank you for coming, and thank you for the article that you published in Financial Times saying that Ukraine will be a NATO member. Do you see that other NATO allies share your views?
Right now, I'm making the argument that Ukraine not only needs to join the EU, and negotiation discussions, formal procedures should start this year, even with the war. I'm arguing that after the war, it's important for all of European security that Ukraine becomes part of the NATO alliance. I have colleagues, countries that agree with me. The other Baltic countries, I was in Poland yesterday, I met with Mateusz Morawiecki. The Poles, of course, also agree, but it's a process that we are now undertaking. I'm looking forward to the NATO summit in Vilnius in just a few months. And I'm hoping that this is something that we can discuss. I don't think that any decision would be expected, but even with the war ongoing, we have to start, all of us, thinking about what will happen after the war. How will we secure the peace? We are now focused, and correctly focused, on helping Ukraine with weapons, with munitions, humanitarian, financial aid now to win the war. But then we have to look ahead, and I'm urging my fellow colleagues to also look ahead, and it's in everyone's interest, not only Ukraine's, but all of Europe's, that Ukraine would be in the NATO alliance.
Indeed, you said in your article that it is only possible when the war ends, when Ukraine wins. And most probably till Vilnius, it's hardly possible. But what is the victory for you? So when we can expect that the moment when Ukraine can be a NATO member arrives?
It's up to Ukraine, Zelensky, the government of Ukraine, to define a victory.
No, because if today Zelensky says that, well, we declare the victory now, it doesn't mean that tomorrow we can be a NATO member.
Well, victory would imply also peace. And there is no peace right now because the Russians are continuing their brutal attack. But how the victory is defined is up to the Ukrainians to define. It's not up to any of us from the outside. Our task is to help you attain your goals by providing you with all the material that we can.
Ukrainians have defined victory for themselves. For us, returning Crimea and Donbass is step number one. It is not the end of the process, but it is necessary for us to see that victory is here. Why don't you say the same?
That's fine. Of course, to me also, that's how I would understand it, a victory with a liberated Ukraine. But this is a process. The war is still ongoing. And again, I have been concerned in the past that some of my European colleagues have tried to have various versions. And I'm arguing that it's not up to any of us from the outside to tell you what a victory is. And what you define seems absolutely right to me as well. But the important is that you define this victory, not anyone from the outside.
I will return shortly to close the issue to the NATO membership and perception in the alliance. Of course, Vilnius summit would define more, but now you are in contact with heads of states and governments who are already in NATO. How do you see? Do they share a view that Ukraine should be a NATO member?
Right now, it's a process. So, before the war, actually, the all-out war started in February 24th. the Baltics, Poland were delivering weapons to Ukraine. We had the US intelligence, we acted on this intelligence. Many of our other friends and allies were not so clear. They were thinking maybe there's no war. Now we are once again saying we have to look forward once again to when the war ends and the role and the place of Ukraine, which should be in NATO. Again, it's not at all that other countries are saying, yes, yes, of course, of course. It's a similar process that there is carefulness. I think maybe that's the best word. No NATO member wants to bring NATO into a war. This is very clear. That's why I'm also stressing that once the war ends, when the war is over, that's what we have to look at. And many NATO partners are not yet looking of what happens after the war. They're still looking at what about today? How can we get more tanks and ammunition? And I agree with that. We have to increase weapons manufacturing in Europe. We have to look at how we can do more. But we also have to start looking to the next step. I see no other choice. I see no other choice for NATO and for Europe. But all political processes are processes, and you always need someone to be in the front. So once again, we seem to be in the front.
Are you sure that Ukraine will definitely win?
I see no possibility of Ukraine losing. I see no possibility of Russia winning. It's completely unimaginable. What your people, what your army has shown is a lesson to everyone. You're fighting for your homeland, for your families. Russia is fighting for Moscow's imperialistic dreams. A soldier is not very motivated to fight for someone else's imperialistic dream. So it seems inevitable that you will win, and it's painful to see that the other side does not yet realize this.
Sometimes Russia, especially under current leadership, can take decisions that can hardly be rational, as we have seen with the big invasion. Do you see that one of these decisions could be attack on one of NATO members or on several NATO members?
Again, as you said, this would be extremely irrational, but it's an irrationality of a different order. So it seems that what Moscow did not at all consider possible was that Ukraine would resist. Moscow was under the illusion that Ukrainians would, in some perverse sense, be happy that they would be occupied and taken over by the Russians. But Moscow never had the illusion or the understanding that anyone would necessarily come to Ukraine's defense, because Ukraine was not and still is not a member, say, of the NATO alliance. With NATO, it's somewhat different, because there is a long-standing tradition and a very clear Article 5 of what being in NATO means. And what NATO has done since 2014, but especially since February 24th, has greatly reinforced the eastern border of NATO, starting in the Baltics down through Romania and Bulgaria. It is also now in the process of accepting Sweden and Finland into the alliance, which is something that before February 24th was unimaginable, because maybe 15-20% of the Swedes or the Finns wanted to be in NATO. They had been neutral Sweden for more than 200 years, Finland for a very long time. Why would they want to change this? Well, Russia's war in your country has convinced them to join NATO. So many things are now changing. And if it was unimaginable 1 year ago, then maybe for some it's not understandable how will Ukraine join NATO. But to me, I see it quite clearly.
I admire Edgar Sienkiewicz, especially for the recent tweet he made. And he wrote, Russia delenda est. Did you see that?
No, I did not see that.
So it's a kind of a phrase of Carthagena delenda est, so yes. Carthagena have to be destroyed. Do you see that the idea of Russia that should be destroyed is widely popular in Europe?
You can say it, I suppose, in many ways. Russia has to lose this war. Russia has to lose this war because as a country which still is imperial, Europe's history, not long ago, we had many imperial powers. As Latvians, we know this. We have been under the empire of the Germans, under the empire of the Poles, under the empire of the Swedes, under the empire of the Russians. The Swedish Empire is no more. They are our friend and ally. The German Empire is no more. They are our friend and ally. The Polish Empire is no more. The Polish-Lithuanian, they are our friends and our allies. The Russian Empire, it still wants to be. And this is the only threat that we face in Europe to our peace and security. We have to make sure that Russia does not succeed in its endeavor to change the world order. And in Europe, from empire, we went to nation states. But nation states individually are vulnerable, but collectively we are very, very strong. And we need to make sure that our strength is strengthened by Ukraine joining us.
Anyway, Russia, even if it loses, there should be some idea in the EU what Russia would look like. How do you see that? What is the post-war Russia?
I don't see anything very positive, unfortunately. There's no indication right now that anything inside of Russia is about to change. The government doesn't seem to be very vulnerable. Civil society has been completely suppressed. Opposition has been either eliminated or put in jail, or they have fled to the West. There's no indication. And because of this, we can assume that Russia will not change in the near future. So we have to adapt to that by becoming stronger, because Russia understands the current leadership and the current imperialistic thinking understands only one thing: strength. They're meeting strength in Ukraine that they never expected. NATO is very strong, and it's getting Ukraine after the war into NATO is what will keep, regardless of what happens inside Russia. We want to make sure they don't come into Europe with armies anymore.
Don't you think that the way to contain Russia for a longer period is to reach their status when Russia would be broken somehow into pieces?
This is a completely different topic, and this is something that would have it would be possible only with internal changes. I don't see easily how this could be done from the outside, and I don't know if this is something that right now we should be putting all of our attention onto. We need to put our attention onto helping Ukraine win the war, and then working with Ukraine to integrate your country into the EU and NATO after the war. Russia is, it's there, it will be a problem, I think, for the next coming generation or longer. I don't think this is short term, but I'm a practical politician also. There are things that I can influence, and there are things that I cannot directly influence. I can help to influence Ukraine's future in the EU and NATO, but what happens on the other side of the border in Russia, that's really up to the Russians.
Ukrainian military man says that to win, we need jets and we need long-distance weaponry. Does the West know that?
Certainly, everyone in the West knows Ukraine's request, and different countries, from the beginning of the war, we both remember. First, the Baltics, Poland gave weapons, no one gave weapons. Then others starting to give weapons, but that said no heavy artillery, no long range this, and then, okay, it was longer range artillery, and then no air, now it's air defenses, no tanks, now it's tanks. So it seems there's a certain pattern evolving, that the first reaction is no, and then eventually, of course. And the reason why some governments are starting to say no is that there is an inherent fear of so-called escalation. But what seems clear is that Moscow can or cannot escalate depending upon what Moscow thinks, not depending upon what any of us on this side of the border do. And I think it's just a question of time But as much as Ukraine needs these kinds of weapons, it's also very clear that Ukraine needs ammunition for the existing weapons, especially artillery ammunition. And here in Europe and in NATO, we have a difficulty that our production capacity is too low. Russia is manufacturing on a war basis as much as they can. In Europe, we are still manufacturing on a peace basis, and the demand is much bigger, and we need to make sure that the production goes up. We are now in discussion of having a joint European purchase of artillery shells, for example, so that companies make the right investments and get the production up. It will happen. I wish we could have it happen sooner, but it will happen.
Let's talk about Latvia-Ukraine relations and Latvian support to Ukraine. I'm not sure if you have heard of that, but recently in Ukraine there was a study that shows that Ukrainians consider Latvia as one of top 5 allies of our country during the war. Could you elaborate what was really provided by Latvia? How does Latvia help us in these hard times?
First of all, we've been helping militarily. So before the February 24th, we were already providing weapons, including Stinger missiles. I understand what your ambassador in my country explained, that these missiles were actually used on February 24th in the airport here in Kiev to help to shoot down the Russian planes coming in. And there was other assistance also from my Baltic friends and from the Poles, but we have been in from before day one. We have, as of today, contributed more than 1% of our gross domestic product on military aid. And on top of that, our civil society, ordinary people, through all kinds of organizations, have been donating and helping in every imaginable way, sending buses, sending automobiles, sending medications, sending humanitarian aid, sending cash, helping Ukrainian society in every way that they can think of. And I can say with a little bit of humor, I find it ironic, but in a good way. We have a law in our country recently passed that if you are drinking far, far too much alcohol, I think it's 1.5 or some incredible amount of alcohol, the government takes your car. And we start to have a problem of what do we do with these cars? And someone, my finance minister, says, why don't we donate them to the Ukrainian army? And then we got in touch. It turns out that there's an interest, and we're sending not just any car, the best cars, the ones that you really want and need. We're sending them to Ukraine. So I can say that our society is 100% supporting Ukraine. Even the people who drink and drive are supporting Ukraine.
By the way, with Latvian society, it's really interesting. I do understand that, unfortunately, you don't have so much homogeneous society. There are some people of Russian origin. How do you manage to get them supporting Ukraine?
We don't convince them. They are intelligent. They follow the news. And if before the war, we had a seemingly large amount of people who are generally sympathetic to Moscow, the latest survey shows that only 4% of our entire population, regardless of what language is spoken at home, is still supporting Moscow. It means basically no one. But remember Latvian history. During World War II, and especially at the end of World War II, the Russians did to Latvia what they're doing to Ukraine, in Bucha, for example. Summary executions, deportations, fake trials, rape of women, pillage and stealing. It happened to us in our living memory, our family memory. And we see it happening to you today. And Latvians responded not because of thinking, but it's complete conviction and emotion. And this is why our government's decision to help Ukraine, it's not dependent upon me or my government or the coalition or politicians. All politicians think this way because all of society thinks this way. So we as a nation, it's been a very, very unique, again, Moscow has done so many things that I'm certain it did not intend. It has strengthened Europe by pushing Europe together. It has strengthened and expanded NATO, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and it has helped to solidify, among others, the Latvian nation. We see that Russia is unfortunately not changed at all, but Latvia has experiences, Latvians have experiences. We read of the deportation of the children and people remember. We look at the mass graves and we remember. We look at the people just being shot and we remember. It's the same, it's repeating and repeating and repeating. And that's why the support is coming, not only from politicians in the government, but very meaningfully from civil society itself.
To finalize, let's talk shortly about the EU future of Ukraine, which I do believe in, and as far as I understand, you do believe also, don't you?
Yes, but it's not only the two of us who believe this. Ukraine has been granted a candidacy status, which is okay. It means we want you in the club. But what I'm arguing is that Europe needs to start formal procedures with your country this year, even with the war ongoing. And when I was speaking with representatives of your parliament and also with Prime Minister Šmichal and his minister, it's quite clear that your government and your parliament is already doing many of the changes, the reforms that any country that wants to join the EU has to do. And we need, from Europe's side, to acknowledge this and to help you get ready to join the European Union, because it's a difficult process. My country went through this some 20 years ago. It means lots of reforms. It means the more reform you do, the more resistance, because there's always someone interested in not having change. But it helped our country tremendously. Business is doing much better. The standard of living has gone up. Investments have been going up. It's all for the better. And we're convinced that, actually, I'm convinced that as much as you need Europe, I think Europe needs you, because Europe needs a new impetus of dynamism. And I think your country right now is the definition of dynamism.
You certainly do feel the mood among all the leaders of the EU member states. Do you see that they are ready? Because finally it will be a political decision to start negotiations this year.
They are not yet ready, but they will be. It's a process. And as with the weapons, we in the Baltics, we were in the avant-garde. In the beginning, many said, no, no, no. Now they say, yes, yes, yes. So once again, we're in the avant-garde. The EU, okay, maybe. And we also say, but also NATO. Oh, let's think. Okay, let's move forward. It's a process. And as the Prime Minister of Latvia, I am fully convinced that we are right, that it is in our interest, the European Union and NATO, that your country become a member of both. One, starting this year, the EU, the second, when the war is over. But in order for Ukraine's path to be looked at in NATO, you have to plan now before the war is over. You have to start planning now, and this is my argument to my colleagues.
You definitely cannot name the date. It is simply impossible. But could you a kind of estimate? It's really impossible to finalize negotiations with the EU in 1 year. But what is realistic?
I think that your country, if any country can set all records, I'm positive it will be your country. Because in other cases, even in my own country's case, as the government was proposing reforms, society in general wanted this, but there were lots of interest groups opposing it. And right now in Ukraine, I feel you have a rare opportunity because of the war, because of what Russia is doing. It seems to be solidifying also your nation into setting its goal. And you seem to be much more united in this wish than maybe many other candidate countries in the early stages were. And this gives you the possibility, I would say, of maybe even being able to do everything quicker than others. But it's a lengthy process at any rate. It's not something that you do from Monday to Wednesday, or you even do within the period of 1 year. But what's very clear is that the process must begin, because once the process formally begins, then everyone sees how quickly it goes or doesn't go. But then it's up to a lot also, not for Europe saying no, but then it's up to the Ukrainians, your government and your parliament, to enact the various reforms. But I am positive that if anyone can do this in a record time, it will be Ukraine.
Thank you very much for supporting Ukraine, and thank you very much for explaining us our definitely bright future.
Thank you.